Good evening. I am Aaron Cohen, Director of the Johnson Space Center. Thank you. It is a great thrill to see so many people in this room tonight who made Apollo a reality, and I thank you for coming. In 1961, John Kennedy, a remarkable president, gave us a remarkable task: to land men on the moon and return them safely within a decade. That challenge provided the remarkable events of this lunar program. And tonight, we have gathered the remarkable people who made it all happen. What a proud night this is for the Johnson Space Center and the surrounding Houston community. In 1969, I had the good fortune to be a dark-haired young man working in the Apollo spacecraft program office, specifically on the command and service module. Meeting the challenge of Apollo with the likes of Bob Gilruth, George Lowe, Chris Kraft, George Jeffs, Joe Gavin, and Dick Batten provided me with the opportunity to work with and learn from our nation's best and brightest engineers, scientists, and mathematicians. Today, as you can see, my hair has turned gray, and it is my privilege to serve as the director of the Johnson Space Center. The legacy of the Apollo program is the very foundation on which this center operates. It is my strong conviction and fervent hope that the persons who gather to recognize the 30th, the 40th, and the 50th anniversary of the lunar landing will have their own remarkable achievements worthy of recognition and honor. This is an evening for celebration, camaraderie, and reflection. In that spirit, I welcome you all to tonight's festivities. Thank you. It is my pleasure now to introduce a staunch supporter of NASA and a friend of the Johnson Space Center, the Mayor of Houston, Mayor Kathy Whitmire.
Thank you, Aaron. It is my pleasure on behalf of the people of the great city of Houston to welcome some former Houstonians back tonight, to welcome a lot of good friends of the space program, and to celebrate with all of you a very great occasion that happened 20 years ago that has changed all of our lives and will further change them in the future. You know, this is a fabulous occasion that you put together here tonight. It reminds me of kind of a cross between a 20-year high school reunion and perhaps the senior prom. But I have really enjoyed chatting with people here who haven't seen each other for a long time and who are reminiscing about some of the most fabulous events that have ever occurred in this country. But I think from a local perspective, none of us is in doubt about what the successes of the space program mean to this community here in Houston. We've been through some good times in Houston. NASA has been through some good times. We've been through some periods of re-examination, and NASA has also been through some periods of re-examination. I think all of us together are stronger today as we look at those new challenges that are now being given to the space program. So I want to give my congratulations to all of you who have made your mark on history. And I also want to give my congratulations to the great people who today make up the NASA program at the Johnson Space Center, to Aaron Coyne for his outstanding leadership, and to all of the staff members and the contractors who are the space team here in Houston. We're all with you. Thanks a lot and congratulations.
I would now like to ask you to please enjoy your meal. I'm very pleased. Can I have your attention, please? I'm very pleased to introduce your Master of Ceremonies for the evening. Jim Hortz was well known to the astronauts, flight controllers, and project managers of Apollo because he spent a lot of time in Houston talking to them and learning about the space program as a correspondent and anchorman for NBC's nightly news. He had a well-deserved reputation as a reporter who always did his work and it could translate NASA jargon and acronyms into clear, simple English and still get it right. And that's a challenge. His pleasant style and gentlemanly manner seemed very, very familiar to us when he became co-host of the Today Show. He is now a 5-time winner of the television industry's highest award, the Emmy, and he currently hosts the award-winning PBS Network's television program, Innovation. Jim, it's really a pleasure to have you back with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. Good evening. You know, I think if we had any decency in our hearts here tonight, we'd just wrap this thing up and let these poor men go home. Neil and Buzz and Mike have been at this 20th anniversary thing since last Saturday now, and I suspect that they're beginning to feel a little bit like the two porcupines making love. Just not sure how much more of this fun they can stand. But Neil and Buzz and Mike, you know this crowd. There is not a person here tonight with any decency in his heart. So you just better sit back and relax and enjoy it. This is not the White House, you know. And Mayor, this is also not a high school prom. These are the people who threw the piano into the swimming pool at the splashdown party 20 years ago. There are a lot of people in this audience tonight who are actually sorry and miss Rotten Reds. And some women, too. For those of you who weren't around here during the Apollo days, I should tell you, I guess, a little bit about Rotten Red's Castaway Bar. It was an elegant, very posh, exceedingly sedate lounge. It was where many high-level decisions in the space program were made. It was in a scenic spot down on Galveston Bay. It was known as a quiet place where the astronauts and the flight directors and occasionally a network correspondent or two would get together and talk about things like Mare Tranquillitatis, Oceanus Procellarum, and Mare Nubium. They played chamber music at Rotten Reds, and they never took the Christmas tree down. It was sort of a place you'd sort of like take your mom, you know? I want to say right here at the beginning that I never saw Neil and Buzz and Mike at Rotten Reds. And I'll continue saying that as long as they want me to. You see, Neil, I think you're dealing with two groups of people here tonight. One, a bunch of rowdies who were sorry that you missed the splashdown party, and they want to pick it up from here. And the other group still has a few things they want to discuss with you from Rotten Reds. I guess I'm like everybody else here tonight. I remember exactly where I was 20 years ago yesterday. I was in Studio 8H at NBC in New York, doing my best to be composed and deliberate and very level-headed about it, all of it, trying to do my job as a reporter and get it all straight and explain it very clearly, except that nobody had ever done a story like this before, man going to another planet, and nobody knew for sure what it meant. Was it a stunt? Was it a waste of money? Should we be spending all that money down here on Earth? Was it only to impress the Russians, or was it, like Werner von Braun said, the equal in importance to the moment in evolution when aquatic life first came out on land? Well, truthfully, I don't think I knew what it all meant at the time, but I think I do now. Today, if you strip all the rhetoric away from it and remove all the strands that connected the moon program to 100 different unconnected things and look at it in its simplest terms, the Apollo program stands out absolutely and singularly as a radiant achievement in American and in world history. When all of the rhetoric is stripped away and when you remove all the arguments that weren't contained in NASA's mandate, the fact is that we went there just to check it out. Friendly-like. No bounty. There was no booty. It was scientific exploration, straight research, national stature to be sure, but mostly, like President Kennedy said, we did it mostly because we chose to. And tonight, we gather here to celebrate that exceptional enterprise. The world has come a long way in 20 years, and no small part of that journey was inspired, I think, by the Apollo program. Just going to the moon, just doing it because it was there, ignited the imagination of millions of people, especially younger people, and today, because of that imagination turned to deeds, we live in a world that is fundamentally different from that of 20 years ago. Today, 20 years later, with 20/20 hindsight, it's possible to see that in all but one case, we were expecting the wrong thing from Apollo. It was not a poverty program. It was not a jobs program. It was not a housing program. It was not a social program. It was an engineering and scientific blueprint organized to demonstrate what man could do with a singleness of mind and a clearly defined goal. At the time, it was the grandest thing we could think to do. There was always a tendency, I think, at least on our side of it, I think, to look at everything in gargantuan terms. After all, making a 6 million pound, 360-foot machine rise straight up off the ground and hurl itself and 3 men to the moon was quite an achievement. But I suggest that the real emphasis should be put on the colossal efforts that were made to make everything small and more efficient. After all, it took 5 pounds of fuel to get 1 pound of machine and man into orbit. So you could say that the energy conservation program began in NASA. The moon program, I think, set the stage for the nation to become lighter and stronger and leaner and meaner and harder and faster. It led the way, if you will, in showing the larger society how to improve its thrust-to-weight ratio. And it wasn't Teflon, which was invented in 1938, and it wasn't Velcro, which has been around since 1957 that the Apollo program spun off. It was the PC, and it was solid-state circuitry, and it was new materials and data processing and quality control, and as much as anything else, the can-do spirit. Nobody says anymore, if we can go to the moon, we can do anything. Frankly, the Apollo program is not a good model to solve every societal problem. The legacy of Apollo is intuitive. It took us to a new level of realization, implanted a new man-made gene in the DNA of our psyche. It became so much a part of us that today most people don't even know it's there. I had a teenager ask me recently, what was the big deal about going to the moon? Well, the big deal about going to the moon is that nobody has been able to duplicate the feat since. It still stands as man's farthest reach. the inspiration, even though today it is subconscious, for the light-year surge in our civilization since. Last week, in a very unscientific experiment, I looked around my office and my home to see the things that I liked and that were important to me, and interestingly, they fell out in two different, very distinct categories. One, the things that I liked because of their artistic and sentimental value. And two, the things that make my life and my business more productive and more comfortable and more profitable. And those things were all less than 20 years old. Word processors, laser printers, cellular phones, energy-efficient buildings, planes, cars, and appliances. In Walter's business and my business, 20 years ago, it took a couple of tons to do what 20 pounds does today. Indeed, the chief tool of our business, the minicam, the instrument that has become the eyes of the world, was invented and first used to show us the news from the moon. None of this says inspired by Apollo, and a lot of it is not stamped, made in USA, but that's okay. I submit that 20 years later, it's time that we discard our worn-out notions of what the moon program was not and accept it for what it was, which was the realization of a universal dream and a spinner of ideas and intimations and expectations and not necessarily products. And while 20 years is but an instant in the history of man, it is fitting that we pause here tonight and honor not just the men who first landed on the moon, but as they themselves have often said, all those who labored together to make it a giant leap for mankind. Everybody remembers one small step, and what fewer people recall are the words on the plaque that they left on the moon. We came in peace for all mankind.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
Apollo 11, this is Houston. You are go for TLI, over. Apollo 11, thank you. Roger, Eagle, contact. Roger, how does it look? The Eagle has wings. Roger. Looking good. Columbia, Houston, over.
Houston, Columbia, read you loud and clear. How many?
Roger, bye-bye, Mike. How did it go, over?
Listen, babe, everything's going just swimmingly. Beautiful.
Okay, all flight controllers, go for landing. Retro.
Go.
Vital.
Go.
Guidance.
Go.
Control.
Go.
Telcom.
Go.
GNC.
Go.
Ecom.
Go.
Surgeon.
Go.
Capcom, we're go for landing.
Eagle, Houston, you're go for landing, over. Roger, understand. Go for landing. 3,000 feet. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
He'll be here in a minute. Before we go any further, I've been asked to introduce to you tonight the people that you've been watching eat up here. Starting down on my far left, the incoming president of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, Buzz Hello. The wife of one of our honored guests here tonight, Lois Aldrin. A more flowery introduction will come from our speakers at the head table tonight, including, ladies and gentlemen, Buzz Aldrin. Her Honor, the Mayor of the City of Houston, Kathy Whitmire. Kathy, I hope being with this rowdy group here tonight doesn't hurt your chances for re-election. If anybody could ever write a book called What It's Like to Be Introduced as the Wife of, this is the person. Ladies and gentlemen, Janet Armstrong. Ladies and gentlemen, Janet Armstrong's husband, Neil. My wife, Alexandra Dixon Hartz. On my right, Aaron Cohen introduced me a few minutes ago. I want to say just a couple things about him for the out-of-towners here tonight. He was the NASA project manager for the development of the Apollo Command and Service Module 20 years ago. He was the man who had the responsibility of bringing it all together and holding it all together for 500,000 miles. Today, he's the director of the Johnson Space Center, Aaron Cohen and Ruth Cohen. Our keynote speaker tonight is a man who can be introduced quicker by citing the things that he hasn't done rather than those he has, Walter Cronkite. The Apollo 11 Command Module pilot, Michael Collins, Pat Collins. Becoming a NASA astronaut in the month following the first moon landing must have been a heady experience for our next guest, but who was to say that that 31-year-old Navy flyer in those days would go on to become the administrator of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, Admiral Richard H. Truelay. Mrs. Cody Truelay. National Honorary Chairman of Space Week, the Chairman of the Board, CEO of Rockwell International, the company which incidentally built the Apollo Command and Service Module, Donald R. Beale and Joan Beale. In addition to having Neil and Buzz and Mike here tonight, we have several other men who have either walked on the moon or flown in the Apollo program with us, and before we go any further, we'd like to recognize them in the audience if we bring the lights up just a little bit. I think we have either one or more representatives of every crew, and I think perhaps that's the best way to recognize them. I don't know whether we're ever going to get spotlights on. Could we have the lights up just a little bit, please? Hello? Thank you. From Apollo... From Apollo 7, Walt Cunningham. From Apollo 8, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders. From Apollo 9, Jim McDivitt, Dave Scott, and Rusty Schweikert. From Apollo 10, Tom Stafford, John Young, and Gene Cernan. From Apollo 12, Pete Conrad's not here tonight. I always loved his first words on the moon. He said it may have been a small step for Neil, but it was a big one for a little guy like me. But his partner is here tonight, one of my favorite people in the whole world, a great artist, Alan Bean. Al, where are you? Everybody gets a personal recollection. I found this quote the other day. is from Marcel Proust, who died in 1922. He said, "Only through art can we get outside ourselves and know another's view of the universe, which is not the same as ours, and see landscapes which would otherwise have remained unknown to us, like the landscapes of the moon. Thanks to art, instead of seeing a single world, our own, we see it multiply until we have before us as many worlds as there are original artists. And many centuries after their core is extinguished, they continue to send us their special rays." Al, thank you. Two of the Hard Luck Gang from Apollo 13, Jim Lovell and Fred Hayes. The Old Man in the Moon, Alan Shepard and Stu Rusa from Apollo 14. When Al came back, he worked as a consultant for NBC, and we were on the air one night and couldn't think of anything to say, and I wrote on a piece of paper, I said, "What was the lousiest thing about being on the moon?" Al picked it up and wrote back, and he said, "Having to appear on NBC afterward." I loved Al's first words on the moon. He said, "We're here." The first dune buggy driver and the first man to find green rocks instead of green cheese on the moon, Dave Scott and Jim Irwin from Apollo 15. From Apollo 16, John Young and Charlie Duke, famous for grits and orange juice. Three years and 6 months after Neil Armstrong first set on the moon, Gene Cernan was the last man to walk on its surface. From Apollo 17, Gene Cernan and command module pilot Ron Evans. And we're also pleased to have with us tonight the crew from the Apollo-Soyuz joint U.S.-Soviet mission, Tom Stafford and Vance Brand. Deke Slayton couldn't be here tonight. Tom, Vance, stand up, please. And also a special guest. Please give a warm round of applause to the commander of the Soyuz part of Apollo-Soyuz and the first man to walk in space, Alexei Leonov. Tom told me earlier that he taught him how to speak English with an Okie accent. Well, a lot of people have worked very hard to make this evening possible tonight, and we want to express our thanks especially to our official hosts of the evening, NASA and the Johnson Space Center, the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, and Space Week. You've already heard from Aaron Cohen speaking on behalf of the JSC, and now I'd like to introduce two others speaking on behalf of our other hosts. 20 years ago, when man first walked on the moon, Don Beale was Executive Vice President of the Electronics Group at Rockwell International, and since that time, he's been through many reincarnations, as has his company. Suffice it to say that this was the outfit that built the command ship for Apollo and more recently all the shuttlecraft. Don was named president of Rockwell 10 years ago and was elected chairman and chief executive officer 18 months ago. He is here with us tonight to help celebrate this great anniversary, acting as National Honorary Space Week chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, Don Beale.
Thank you very much, Jim. I feel just privileged to be here. Go as far as you can see, a historian once said, and when you get there, you'll be able to see much farther. Tonight, we join to celebrate a journey and singular accomplishment which most of all for all of us, opened our eyes to see the promise of the future. It threw a glorious spotlight on human ability and achievement. 20 years ago, a whole world watched and marveled at what a nation could accomplish when her people worked together and when hard work combined with equal measures of patience and faith. After reaching this important destination, our sights were immediately fixed on others in the vast reaches of space. The vision the President shared with us yesterday was clear and provides not only a solid foundation for the future of space exploration, but also good reason to venture into the future with renewed confidence. This year's Space Week activities are contributing once again to fostering greater appreciation and, I think, support for America's leadership in space. I've been very proud to serve as chairman of Space Week this year. In this capacity, I'm also honored to recognize all those around the country who make this national celebration a great success. People like Chris Kraft, who's national chairman of the Apollo anniversary, and the many volunteers of Space Week national headquarters who are deserving of recognition for their commitment of time and energy, and not just in this important 20th anniversary, but every year. Space Week is important because it is an annual affair, and we should be privileged to support it annually. Many companies and space-related organizations have helped underwrite or promote Space Week activities, and I would like to offer a special thanks to NASA for its enthusiastic participation and support of these efforts every year. With activities underway all across this nation, Space Week is one of the many ways in which American citizens can become involved in celebrating our nation's space heritage and contributing to its future, as well they should, because in reaching one destination, our natural tendency is to wonder about what the next one will be, and with that wonder comes a great deal of desire, and with desire, determination. Let this week be a reminder, then, that we Americans must share a determination to go forward, boldly and unafraid, into the new frontiers of tomorrow. And we will, setting our sights upon the horizon and our hopes upon what is just beyond. Thank you all for what you've meant to America's legacy in space, and for your contributions to this week of celebration and to those of many tomorrows. Thank you very much.
Years ago, our next guest was Rockwell's Vice President and General Manager of Saturn Apollo launch operations at the Kennedy Space Center. He led the Rockwell team that achieved 6 successful launches, including 3 landings on the moon. In the midst of the Apollo program, he changed hats and managed the team that developed the Space Shuttle, and then went on still later to manage the B-1 bomber. He got a piece of the Collier Trophy for that one. He went on to head North American Aircraft Group, then the North American Aircraft Operations, and most recently he was Rockwell Corporation's Senior Vice President in charge of Washington operations. Recently retired from Rockwell, he is now the incoming president of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. Ladies and gentlemen, Bastian Buzz Hello.
Thank you, Jim. Honored guests and ladies and gentlemen, my greetings come to you from the AIAA, the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. And on behalf of our 42,000 members, it's really a privilege to be part of this celebration of the monumental things that took place that culminated in man's first landing on our moon. Now, we're dedicated, the AIAA, to the improvement of the science and technology of astronautics and aeronautics, and to the development of our professional development of our members. And it's in that light that I'd like to recognize those members of our Houston section of the AIAA who worked hard to make part of this night possible. Ava Lunsford, chairperson of the event. Ava has done a monumental job. Jeanette Strickland and Scott Satterwhite. And let me just extend a special recognition to Walter Lukey, our Houston section chairman. And really to all the members of the Houston section. I know they all pitched in to help support this gala. Now, nowhere that certainly I'm aware of has the impact of the practice of the science of and technology of aerospace been greater than right here in Houston in the Johnson Space Center. Nowhere. There are literally hundreds of AIA members, associate fellows, fellows, and honorary fellows among those who have contributed to this event, and whose exploits, of course, we celebrate tonight. There are far too many to recognize individually, but I would like to pick out three who are honorary fellows who typify this host. Robert Gilruth, the first director of the NASA Manned Spacecraft Center. Christopher Kraft, the second director of the NASA Manned Spacecraft Center. And last but certainly not least, Maxime Faget, designer of the Mercury capsule. This has been just a great night for an absolutely terrific Apollo team. Please enjoy yourselves, and thank you very, very much.
Buzz just made my night a lot shorter. I had a few more introductions here, and he just got half of them. I'd like to recognize a couple more people in our audience. Former Administrator of NASA, Tom Paine. Tom, where are you? Also, former Deputy Administrator Robert Siemens. Former Deputy Administrator, former Secretary of the Air Force, Hans Mark. And former Deputy Administrator, Apollo Program Director, beg your pardon, retired General Sam Phillips. And also former Associate Administrator, George Miller. Buzz mentioned two of the directors of the Johnson Space Center. I'd like to mention two more, Jerry Griffin and Aaron Cohen, please. And what seemed like in those days a bunch of teenagers carrying the responsibility of a multi-billion-dollar program on their shoulders, the guys who had to make the quick now fast decisions, the flight directors, those that I think are here tonight, Gene Kranz, Jerry Griffin, Glenn Lunny, Cliff Charlesworth, Pete Frank, and Milt Wendler. Would you all please stand? Well, this evening is the climax of a round of celebrations that began for our special guests last Saturday in Huntsville, Alabama, and proceeded on to Cape Canaveral on Sunday, where there was a ceremony on the 20th anniversary of the actual launch, and then it was on to Washington for special events at the Smithsonian Institution and a meeting with the President, and finally here tonight. After tonight, they get to resume life as ordinary mortals for another 5 or 10 years, and then all of us who are still alive and can make any sense will be back here again. The fact is that if you've been watching and listening to these men in recent days and in recent years, you will have noted that they don't particularly care to look backward much any longer. They've all been saying to anyone who will listen that their eyes are now definitely on the future, and it is to Neil and Buzz and Mike that we turn now. Over the years, I've come to believe that Michael Collins is the single hardest person to introduce in a public forum. So much nonsense has been written about the fact that he almost made it to the moon, but not quite, and that he was incredibly jealous, almost to the point of fuming while he circled 60 miles above the moon while his buddies were down there making history. Mike has been portrayed as the odd man out, the loser in the lunar lottery, the invisible man. How can you deal with this to introduce this man, especially when the record tells such a diametrically opposed story? Listen to the record. Born in Rome, educated at St. Albans, in Washington, then to West Point, then to Harvard, fighter and test pilot for the Air Force, spacewalker on the Gemini program, retired U.S. Air Force Major General, Assistant Secretary of State, Director of the National Air and Space Museum, the man who brought that wonderful place in under budget and ahead of schedule, Vice President, that's good enough right there. Vice President of LTV, and since 1985, the head of his own firm. Along the way, he picked up the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the Collier, Goddard, and Harmon trophies. And if you want a literate and thoughtful account of Apollo 11 and his days in the space program, I suggest that you pick up copies of his books, Carrying the Fire, Flying to the Moon and Other Strange Places, and Liftoff, the story of America's adventure in space. I submit that this is not the portrait of a man who spent a great deal of time brooding about his Apollo seat. A couple of days ago, I asked a former high-ranking official here in NASA to describe Mike's contribution to the moon program. And he said, outspoken in a constructive way, he is always logical and he is always right. A contemporary writer in the 1960s described him as the living spirit of good and graceful manners. Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Collins.
There are a lot of really nice places in this country, and if Neil had said Hilton Head, the Eagle has landed, or Indianapolis or Peoria, the Eagle has landed, I suppose I would have gotten used to the idea before very long. But he said Houston, and to that word has a special, almost a magical sound to me, and I think for you too, at least I suspect so, for all of you or most of you. Each of us, each in our own way, has a special recollection, I think, of Houston over the past 20 years, and listening to President Bush yesterday, my paraphrase would be, you ain't seen nothing yet. So I'd like to ask you to remain seated, but to raise your glass with me in a toast to Houston and to the future. To Houston and to the future.
If Michael Collins is the hardest man to introduce in a public forum, the second hardest man to introduce is Buzz Aldrin. You see, he actually went to the moon, and even though he and Neil landed together at the exact same moment in the same spacecraft, since Neil actually stepped out on the surface first, Buzz is relegated to second place on a technicality. And that is an unfair characterization of his achievements and contributions. The truth is, NASA had 3 supremely qualified astronauts on Apollo 11, any one of whom could have been the first on the moon, and the nation would have been proud. In fact, I can make a pretty good case for Buzz. His educational achievements at the time were perhaps unmatched by any of the other astronauts. He graduated 3rd in his class from West Point. He had a PhD in astronautics from MIT. His thesis was Guidance for Manned Orbital Rendezvous. He had the most recent experience in space, having flown the final Gemini mission, during which he spent 5.5 hours outside the spacecraft walking in space. Besides that, he was the oldest of the three. You see, when you start making comparisons among these three guys, you just end up digging yourself in deeper and deeper to know really good again. But the truth is, according to Buzz in his new book, there was only one way that they could get out of the spacecraft because of the way the door was made. He couldn't get around, and so Neil had to go out first. So it seems the guy who put the hinges on made one of the most fateful decisions in man's history. In his career, Buzz has been honored with numerous achievements: the Air Force Distinguished Service Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster, the Legion of Merit, NASA Distinguished, an Exceptional Service Medal, and the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Most recently, Buzz has contributed a lot of new ideas to Earth-Moon and Earth-Mars perpetual orbits, and like Mike, he has become a popular author with a newly published book entitled Men from Earth. Ladies and gentlemen, Buzz Aldrin.
Thank you. Yesterday was a big day for me. For over a year, I've been trying to build a fire in this country to chart a course for the future. And what happened on the steps of the Air and Space Museum was nothing short of fantastic and beyond my expectations. The President set a course that to me was particularly heartening because there was the word that was expressed later in the barbecue that we had at the White House, a sustaining effort. And I received this message from him as I sat across and had a big choice of whether I was going to have a hot dog or a hamburger. And I want to thank everybody for serving much more appetizing meal here tonight. It's wonderful. We flew down here and had a splashdown party and joined so many friends from home. So many I can't even begin to think, but one in particular, it reminded me when we tripped off or almost tripped off the helicopter on the carrier and then got inside that little quarantine facility. Shortly after we were in there and had a physical exam, the flight surgeon who was in there said, "I've got some tapes of what was happening when you guys were up there. Would you like to see what the reaction was?" So he played some of these over, and I was just so tempted because we could see Walter Cronkite and how he expressed things, and I was just tempted, and I looked over at Neil and I said, "Neil, you know, we missed the whole thing." Well, tonight we're going to hear it from the man who was there. We viewed the 1,000 points of light last night, and there were a bunch of people around, and I got to look out there on the horizon and said, "There it is. There's the moon." We should have had a countdown for moonrise last night. So next time we do this morning I got up and was able to share some thinkings with some people who are planning these next Mars trajectories. And then I had lunch at Brennan's, and again, it was better than hot dogs. And met some people there from the Challenger Center, and then went over to where the Challenger Center is at the Houston Museum of Natural History. And the reason I wanted to do that is because I've been carrying around toothpicks that represent how I think certain things in the future ought to be. And some students have been doing some work at the University of Houston, and they built a neat spaceport similar to what my toothpicks are. And they built a cycling spaceship. And I would hope that I don't have to carry toothpicks anymore. And if you people would go over there that are interested and take a look and see what some of these concepts are. There was also another special event that happened at Brennan's. As I was chatting with some good friends, there was a young man sitting close by. And he came up and wanted to present me with something, and it was red, white, and blue. And his father was very instrumental in my getting in the astronaut program. And it was great to see Eddie White there. And I thought maybe some of you would like to know what my kids are doing now. Mike, who was a little younger than Eddie, flies for Delta now as a flight attendant. And Jan, just 4 months ago, allowed me to become a proud grandfather. My son Andy finally got his bachelor's degree at age 26, but he's really moving on. He studied under that man that told us why we went to the moon, John Logsdon. And he's now working on his PhD, Rand, on Soviet studies. And I'm very proud of all my kids. And and they grew up here and learned at the schools and got to meet some really nice kids, and it's nice to see the parents and the kids that they got to meet. I've got 3 more kids now, thanks to Lois. We got married a year and a half ago on Valentine's Day. The program says, a footprint upon time, a step into space, and the beginning of an incredible journey into the future. Yesterday, we reinvigorated that journey into the future. And for all of us, Godspeed.
The reason why Buzz and Mike sometimes are hard to introduce is because Neil is so easy. Everybody, I mean everybody on the face of the earth knows who this man is, so what can you really say? That kind of recognition is reserved for just a few people, and only a few of the few really deserve it. Neil has been fooling around with high-performance aircraft and spacecraft since 1949 when he graduated from Purdue. 78 combat missions for the Navy in Korea, test pilot at Edwards and other places. He flew over 200 models of high-performance aircraft, including the X-15. He was a command pilot on Gemini 8, which was the first docking in space. His awards include the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the Goddard and Collier Trophies, Congressional Space Medal, Professor of Aerospace Engineering at the University of Cincinnati, runs his own company. Everybody's been telling the story of the moon landing this week, and I'm not sure how much I can add to it, except I heard he just told my wife a while ago, we're talking about being the first man on the moon. He said, well, you know, to a pilot, landing is a real important thing, not walking to the airport. Remember one other story. It came from the debriefing when Neil and Buzz and Mike got back. There was a lot of discussion among the engineers there precisely where the landing had occurred, and one of the engineers asked Neil why in the final few seconds he seemed to sort of be drifting around. And Neil replied, I was reserving a pilot's inherent right to be wishy-washy about where I landed. On that day and on this night, I think everyone in America was and is prepared to concede just about any right or privilege he chooses to invoke. Ladies and gentlemen, Neil Armstrong.
Thank you. Thank you. This past week in NASA centers and aerospace companies across the nation, the alumni of Apollo have gathered to celebrate and remember their work of a generation ago. We all remember the images of Apollo. We remember the thundering Saturn rising majestically from a Florida beach, the eerie television of bulkily clad figures roving an alien landscape. Many remember those images and where they were when they saw them. But the men and women of Apollo, the men and women of the Apollo program, remember not only what emerged, what came out of that effort, but more importantly, what they put into it. Building trajectories and strategies that would be forgiving of human failures and system errors. Designing valves and solenoids and rocket injectors that were superior to and more reliable than any that had ever been previously devised. Shearing ounces from the spacecraft that were almost human in their tendency to gain weight. Conceiving, creating, building, testing. They gave their time and their skill, their care, and their heart and their soul without limitation to make America the premier spacefaring nation. It was the most intense, the most challenging, the most difficult period in their lives, but most would also say those were the best days of their lives. Thanks.
Ordinarily, when you have to introduce a keynote speaker like ours tonight, you call up his employer, CBS in this case, and you say, send me over a short bio, page or two. We did that for Walter Cronkite, and they sent over 8 pages. Single-spaced, tiny type, abbreviated. It wasn't a biography, it was a history course. We look for the things that are germane here. Walter was born in St. Joseph, Missouri, not quite 73 years ago. He grew up and was next seen here in Houston, Texas, beginning his journalism career on the Post, and then he wrote for the Houston Press after college. Walter's broadcast career had an inauspicious beginning in my hometown in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It's a tale of how perseverance and blind luck can overcome adversity and doubt. I'll let him tell you that story. Actually, Walter's career is like Monopoly, you know. You start at go, and then you advance to UPI, World War II, North Atlantic, North Africa, D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, the German surrender, Nuremberg and Moscow. Then there's CBS, Korea, Vietnam, North and South, Middle East, Poland, Hungary, China, Watergate, the coronation of Queen Elizabeth, Khrushchev's U.S. visit. Here are some of his exclusive interviews. Listen to this list. Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, and Bush. Not bad. His own programs, Air Power, You Are There, The 20th Century, 21st Century, Eyewitness, Walter Cronkite at Large, Walter Cronkite's Universe, CBS Reports, and, of course, the CBS Evening News for 19 years. Awards, DuPont, White, Polk, Peabody, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and a closet full of television Emmys. Honorary doctorates from Notre Dame, Harvard, Northwestern, Michigan, Massachusetts, Bucknell, Syracuse, and Ohio State. And in all of this, Walter somehow managed to cover the U.S. space program. In the early days, from Cape Canaveral, when rockets were going to Titusville instead of Jupiter, all the way. all the way down to the shuttle. During a moment of delirium a few years ago, NASA decided to send a journalist into space, and Walter applied. And before the program was postponed, unfortunately, because of the Challenger, he was on the short list. His last name ought to be Mitty, you know. As usual, Walter was at the CBS anchor desk when Neil and Buzz set foot on the moon, and some time ago, Walter made a rare confession. He said, "I experienced a first in my life, too. I found myself on the air, speechless." Tonight, 20 years later, we learned if he has regained his poise. Ladies and gentlemen, Walter Cronkite.
Jim, you're a tough act to follow. You're a tough act to compete against, and you're a worse one to follow. It is true that I was speechless 20 years ago, and I guess there are more people tonight who wish that were so tonight than even recognize the fact 20 years ago. Keynote speeches shouldn't come at this hour of the night. I think it should be a postscript, probably, to all the wonderful things have been said here tonight about the Apollo program, about what it meant, what it is. Was I speechless? Was I speechless? I thought that maybe I was having the opportunity tonight, 20 years later, that I've been looking for all those years, and that's to finally tell a few people who weren't able to watch the broadcast, the CBS broadcast, that is, that, with apologies, Jim, I would be able to tell them what I said that night. Now I learn that in the seclusion of the chamber, the astronauts themselves watched the tape, and so I can assume that maybe some of the rest of you who were rather busy at that moment watched the tapes as well. But for those of you who didn't, you may want to take paper and pencil, by the way, for these were immortal words. When I did find my voice, they should be really placed on Mars when we get there, I suppose, because, well, they were momentous. What I said was, I quote this directly, "Oh boy." Oh, actually, I had more. I gathered my wits at that point and went right ahead. My next word was, "whew," followed by, again, for emphasis, clearly planned, "boy." But I wasn't the only one. I looked over at Wally Schirra sitting next to me, and he had tears rolling down his cheeks, as I did down mine. I almost got that same feeling tonight. What a magnificent job you did, Jim, and all of you, in putting that presentation together. Thrilling. Thrilling. The dinner was, too, by the way, whoever did that. Beautiful. And the decorations, the whole thing. And what 20 years ago, it doesn't seem possible, but what a reunion. Viewed by posterity, what I said may lack the resonance, of course, of that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, but my reaction, I think, was made up in feeling for probably what it lacked in content. I was overcome. Here I was, a professional reporter, supposedly, a professional communicator, and there I was, speechless. The really remarkable thing, of course, is that I'd had just as long to prepare for that moment as the whole Apollo program had. Look what the Apollo program did, and look what I was able to come up with. But you know, I'm pretty positive that everybody felt that same inexpressible high that had caught hold of me. And not just Americans, of course, but the multitudes all around the globe. In fact, of all the millions of Earthlings who knew men were finally standing on the moon, the least spaced out probably were Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. But what thrills they gave us, and what memories. We could recount them, of course, here tonight, and we have been doing some of that for hours, and indeed we'll continue to do it forevermore. The memory of Buzz Aldrin joking about not locking himself out as he climbed out of the hatch and into immortality, of course. Both Neil and Buzz describing their initial impressions that seemed to be so different at the moment and gave it human dimension. To Neil, it was stark beauty. To Buzz, magnificent desolation. The deployment of the plaque, saying, as we noted here, from here, men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 A.D. We came in peace for all mankind. The American flag and the phone call from President Nixon, in which Neil said, "It's a great honor and privilege for us to be here representing not only the United States, but men of peace of all nations with an interest and curiosity and a vision for the future." 20 years later, I think we're thankful still that from the beginning, the Apollo 11 astronauts saw their mission not only as an achievement of the United States, but most importantly, as a milestone in the history of man. Will you pass me some of that? Here, I'll borrow yours. As Winston Churchill used to say, water, except he lied. Those thoughts, of course, of peace, of man making this venture for all men, those thoughts were picked up by others, repeated by many of the space philosophers of the time. With us in our studio were two great men of vision, Arthur Clarke and Robert Heinlein. Heinlein was dead certain that what we had just seen was only the start of man's space exploration, of trips to all our sister planets, even to other stars. And Clarke said, and when they do go out, just as when they came to this country, they'll forget their original nationalities. We're going to see them going out into space as nations which will develop new ideas. I suppose that underneath whatever veneer I have picked up in half a century or so as a newsman, cynical veneer, I'm afraid, in many ways, I'm still sort of a simple gee whiz sort of a guy. I believe in progress. I believe that man can solve his problems and better his condition on this planet if he puts his mind to it. I have this faith in technology and science and engineering. I feel that they can help us move mountains if we keep them under control. I think our country ought to stand for something, quite a lot of good things, and when it does, I'm proud of it, proud of being an American. And I guess that puts me in our country's mainstream. And as a member of the mainstream, the epic flight of Apollo 2 was my kind of story, and it couldn't have happened at a better time for America than for us Americans. Most of us will remember that 1969 wasn't the best of times. The war in Vietnam was tearing us apart. There were peace talks, of course, stumbling along, as I remember, in Paris inconclusively. The U.S. contingent in Vietnam was being reduced, but the bloodshed continued. Sometime around April, the number of American dead passed the total in the Korean War, 33,000. It was to go quite a bit higher. Anti-war demonstrations routinely brought out tens of thousands of people. Some of them threw rocks at policemen and National Guardsmen, and they naturally responded. If the burning of one American flag upsets us today to the point of amending the Constitution, we might remember that in 1969, flag burning was a standard operating procedure in some quarters of our country. Now, Vietnam wasn't the only thing dividing the country. After years of heroic efforts to win the ordinary rights of citizenship, black leaders were giving way to new, angrier voices who spoke of withdrawal instead of integration. Some armed themselves and even shot it out with the police. And so many of our better students had little time or inclination to study anything, expanding all their energies instead in occupying administration buildings and closing down campuses and even bombing laboratories, confronting all authority figures, whether in the university or on the police force or wherever, challenging the very scholarship they supposedly were there to further, demanding it be replaced by something more relevant, whatever in the devil that was. There are issues that divide us today, of course. There undoubtedly were issues that divided men when they first banded together with clubs and spears to hunt game. But there was a special ugliness about the late 60s, giving rise to even fear that civilization itself, at least American civilization, was in mortal danger. We certainly were losing faith in ourselves. And in this dismal setting, what a breath of fresh air the Apollo project was. It was grounded in optimism and predicated on teamwork. It honored an old American tradition, rolling back an unexplored frontier. And while there were those who saw our moon mission as primarily one to beat the Russians, or saw in it primarily a military objective to dominate space from a lunar platform, the motive that most Americans took to their hearts was a much more splendid one. Simply put, to explore the unknown, to expand the parameters of human knowledge. My colleague Eric Severide summed up both sides of the argument on the air that night before Apollo 2 was launched. I must say that until that time, Eric, to me, it seemed generally contemptuous of the space program. But the grandeur of the occasion got to him down there at the Cape. I felt that he blossomed right there before my very eyes. Throughout our coverage, he was as eloquent and thought-provoking as only Eric Severide could be. So, with your permission, I'm going to quote him with some words that are particularly pertinent today and are far more eloquent, I must say, than, oh boy, whoo. Eric said, "The core of the argument is philosophical, almost religious, and concerns the nature of man and his society. There are men here passionately convinced that we cannot plan our opportunities, but must take them at the tide when they come, that without new frontiers always beckoning, an energetic people rusts and corrodes, that space is not only the cutting edge for science today, but a moral substitute for war that could give the quarreling human race some sense of common identity, of brotherhood. And there are men convinced with equal passion that this adventure, however majestic its drama, is only one more act of escape, that it is man once again running away from himself and his real needs, that we're approaching the bright side of the moon with the dark side of ourselves, with chauvinism, competitive aggression, and that the chief uses of space will be military in the end. We do know that history has never proceeded by a rational plan. Not even science knows what it is doing much beyond the immediate experiment. We know that the human brain will soon know more about the composition of the moon than it knows about the human brain. We will know why the moon is what and where it is before we know why human beings do what they do. We are still closer to our animal origins than to any millennium in peace. It is possible that the divine spark in man will consume him in flames, that the big brain will prove our ultimate flaw, like the dinosaur's big body, that the metal plaque Armstrong and Aldrin expect to place on the moon will become man's epitaph. But the future has never revealed itself. It is made step by step, moment by moment. The next great moment is now at hand." Beautiful words from Eric Severide. Well, the next great moment of which Eric spoke, of course, that day was the Eagle departure and landing then on the moon. But how appropriate his remarks are now, 20 years later, as we ponder the nature of our next great moment. Some people today seem to have the idea that the moon landing itself has been demeaned because we have not met in these ensuing 20 years all the optimistic hopes for our space future that were voiced in the euphoria of Apollo 11's success. Well, we've not met all those promises, of course, and who knows that better than all of us here. We have flown a successful, reusable shuttle and thus taken the first step toward an orbiting space station. But we've not established a space colony, nor a base on the moon, nor gone to distant planets. In fact, we have met almost none of the spoken promises of 2 decades ago. This is not the way we would have liked it, but that's the way it has been. Disputed priorities within the space program, unclear objectives, presidential disinterest, inadequate funding, all have contributed to the American doldrums in space exploration. Discouragement is to be expected among those who have given so much to the program and are impatient for further great adventures within their lifetimes. And it's a shame that through a sense of inactivity in the space program, public enthusiasm has been permitted to wane. But from the broad perspective of history, these years since the Apollo missions have been but a flicker of an eyelid. They do not mark a cessation of man's exploration of space, but only a hiatus, and historically speaking, a very brief hiatus at that. The pause in no possible way should be considered a reflection of any kind on Apollo, or more specifically on all of us, of our pioneering space exploration, a generation who dreamed and spoke so enthusiastically of the future on that day of triumph 20 years ago. The accomplishments of all of you who planned the missions, who built the spacecraft, who made the difficult decisions in mission control, who flew beyond where man had ever been, who flew the first great steps out there. Let's not forget that Borman, Lovell, Anders, Stafford, Cernan, Young all went to the moon too. They helped show the way. All the accomplishments of all of you did pave the way to the future, no matter when the next person takes that great step for mankind. And by the way, mentioning John Young, if you can tell a personal reminiscence story, I can, doggone it. Not as charmingly, of course, Jim, but I got to tell you once, I was reminded of telling Mr. Cohen that John Young took me for a ride in the shuttle simulator out here at the Johnson Space Center, and we'd landed thing, and the voice control came and said, "John, we've got an indication of a fire in here." And John turned to me and said, "What in the world are they doing? We're just, taking a few simulator rides here. I don't even have my books. We've never practiced fire on the run out like this." Just with that, they came in again and said, John, we've got an indication of a fire in here." And he said, I know, I'm working on the problem." And he said, "Oh, not in the simulator program, here in the building. Get the hell out of there." Well, there's going to be more delay in our space program. We're in a kind of a happy 24-hour euphoria right now after the events in Washington yesterday. But we can't expect that we're going to immediately be able to build the machines and start out toward Mars, of course. Nobody realistically believes that. One thing that has happened since Apollo is a change in the financial fortunes of our country, of course. The next steps are going to have to compete for shrunken resources with urgent social programs to house the homeless, educate the underprivileged illiterate, protect the environment, reestablish the competitiveness of American industry. But need I go on? There are some who wish that some of the vast expenditures for the military utilization of space could be reappropriated for the peaceful exploration of space, even as the vision was projected by the words of Neil and Buzz and on that plaque that they left on the moon. And then perhaps we could share the vast expenses of further exploration with the Soviet Union and other nations, and we could get on with more expeditiously with the challenges ahead of all mankind. Perhaps out there we could escape the artificial national rivalries that stifle us in our Earth environment. But however it's done, surely imaginative leadership in our space program will win out. We are celebrating tonight the supreme technological achievement of our 20th century, a century of great inventions and of scientific progress. Why, in the lifetime of most of us here, we've plunged into at least 6 engineering, scientific, technological eras, any one of which could qualify as a whole age of man. The nuclear age, the computer age, the petrochemical age, the telecommunications age, the DNA age, and of course, the space age. And in our 20th century, we also experienced 2 great world wars that saw the destruction of great cities and irreplaceable works of art and cost millions of lives. And we watched empires wither and others grow. 400 years from now, in the year 2389, the children of our descendants living in space stations and on the moon and perhaps on other planets will be gathering in their schoolrooms or at their telecomputers or whatnot. And if future educational systems overcome our present aversion to teaching history, they'll be spending a little time learning about the 20th century. We can't even be sure exactly what those descendants of ours are going to look like. We know how natural selection has increased the size of the human body in the last 400 years. Think what the influence of an artificial space environment plus man's manipulative capacity with DNA discoveries might do to future humans. At any rate, we should be fairly certain that they'll somehow absorb their history, maybe even through thought transference or whatnot. Maybe that's the only way to teach children history. But of one thing we can be even more certain. The one event of the 20th century, the one event whose date those spacelings of the 24th century will be asked to memorize, will be Apollo 11's landing on the moon, July 20, 1969. That was the day, way back then, their teachers will tell them, when a primitive spacecraft with dangerously explosive fuel in great tanks that left the Earth in a frightening, although controlled explosion, finally, after an incredibly long voyage of more than 2 days, landed on the moon, and 2 men in great cumbersome costumes got out while the whole world held its collective breath. It was so dangerous a mission, it was thought. And children, they'll be told, that began the age of space exploration. That led to the creation of our home here on Colony 12, or wherever. And they'll learn that, incredible as it will seem then, in 2389, people on Earth actually argued about whether it was worth spending the money to send those early explorers into space. Well, doesn't it all sound kind of familiar? Queen Isabella's precarious funding of Columbus, a little grumbling in the royal court. After all, despite the great political movements and even the birth of the Renaissance, what is the one date we all remember from the 15th century? Of course, October 12th, 1492. Most of our century's great events will be but asterisks in future history books compared to man escaping Earth and landing on a distant orb. And you were there. Even those of us who participated only as reporters can take great satisfaction in having been present at the beginning of a great new age of man. So, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, and the thousands of others who made possible and supported you in your great adventure. May I close with words familiar to most of you, Shakespeare's Henry V, as he rallied his outmanned forces to battle the French at Agincourt. Gentlemen in England, now abed, shall think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhood cheap, whiles any speaks that fought with us upon St. Crispin's Day. Thank you, and God bless you.
We're very near the end of this evening. One more speaker. I want to thank the organizers of this celebration for inviting me to be here as a part of this evening. And I want to add my congratulations to Neil and Buzz and Mike for their outstanding achievements on Apollo 11 and to all the men and women who made it possible. I count the years that I covered the Apollo program among the happiest and most rewarding of my life, and I thank everyone involved for that great adventure and for this wonderful evening. 3 weeks ago today, Richard Truly retired as a Rear Admiral in the United States Navy. His retirement lasted exactly 24 hours. The next day, he became the 8th Administrator of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, the first astronaut to hold that job. In the 3.5 years prior to this month, Dick had successfully led the effort to get the shuttle back flying again, and this year he was awarded both the Collier and the Goddard trophies. Dick was the pilot on the STS-2, the Columbia, first manned spacecraft ever reflown in space. He was the commander of the STS-8, the Challenger, in the first night launch and night landing in the shuttle program, and prior to joining NASA, Dick was a Navy fighter pilot with more than 7,500 hours of jet time. Did you ever stop and think about that? If you fly a jet 500 miles an hour on an average, it means that Dick Truly has flown 3,757,000 miles. Furthermore, if you consider that he was born about 200 miles from here over in Fayette, Mississippi, which is just a little bit south of Panther Swamp, it means that he sure came a long way to get here tonight. Dick's got the Distinguished Service Medal, 2 Legions of Merit, the Navy Distinguished Flying Cross, Doolittle Award, Harmon Trophy, among other achievements. But his friends here in Houston tell me that he's proudest of the fact that he is president for life of the Ace Moving Company. Ladies and gentlemen, Admiral Richard Truly.
America's space program is about leadership, and leadership, in my opinion, is about presidents. Like President Kennedy standing on the steps of Rice Stadium behind me, and yesterday President Bush on the steps of the the Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. It's late tonight. It's been a long evening and a wonderful one. And in saying goodnight, I can't top the words of my boss. The White House, July 20th, yesterday, 1989. Barbara and I are delighted to send our warmest greetings to everyone gathered in Houston to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the first Apollo lunar landing. With the success of Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin fulfilled the dreams of Americans and of people throughout the world and throughout the ages, the exploration of the moon. It is fitting, therefore, that we recall our pride in that remarkable and historic achievement and honor the thousands of men and women of NASA and the aerospace community who made it possible. However, the anniversary of the moon landing is not merely a time to commemorate the past. It is an opportunity to reaffirm our commitment to the future of America's space program. Whether pursuing the development of Space Station Freedom, returning to the moon, or reaching out to Mars, the exploration of space, our last great frontier, poses technical challenges for the United States and offers immense rewards for mankind. I know that NASA and America are up to the challenge. As we work to ensure that our nation's space program remains second to none, Barbara joins me in sending our best wishes for an enjoyable anniversary celebration. May God bless you, George Bush. Thank you.
It was my understanding that Dick was going to close the evening off. That's it for tonight. Enjoy yourself. Thank you for coming. Dancing for those of you who still have the stamina. Thank you and good night.